Well, welcome back, everyone. Today, I'm honored to be joined by Mr. Joffre Swait. Thank you
Happy to
very
be
much for
here.
joining me. Yeah,
Yeah.
pleasure to have you. You grew up partly in Brazil. That's correct.
Right.
Yeah. What were the biggest things you noticed that were differences between Brazil and the U.S.?
Well, some of it I was too young. I was 12 when we moved up here for good to really notice right away. But absorbed or became aware of as I was older. But immediately, I can tell you that we were really looking forward to trying root beer for the first time. So I have a strong memory. So my mom's family is American, and we landed in. We stayed in Long Island, New York, for a couple of weeks with family, and then went off to live in Canada, actually. But yeah, so we got off the plane, told our grandpa we really wanted to try root beer. Did that. Some old men were watching lacrosse at the TGI Fridays, and that's like still my enduring memory of what life in the States would be like. And then we moved to Alberta, Canada, and the camera is probably showing, if you're watching this on YouTube, how big I am. I'm enormous. So when I was 12, I was already man-sized, and my dad definitely at one moment had to take me aside and tell me to stop standing so close to the Canadians. I was making them uncomfortable. So yeah, little things like that for sure.
That's funny. The Canada and the U.S., I assume there's a difference there as far as like the U.S. people would not probably mind how big you are because
I think it would depend on where. I mean, there are plenty of big Dutch Canadians. It's just more the concept of personal space. I think it would depend on where in the States you were. Albertans are like, I think, American Westerners in that regard. But someone from Alabama definitely, people from Alabama don't mind just telling me how big I am and want to know about the sports I've played and exactly. All that.
Yeah. What were you guys doing down in Brazil?
Yeah, so I mean, we were just living there. My dad's Brazilian. But his education was in the United States and paid for by the Brazilian government. So I was born in Brasilia because the deal my dad had to fulfill was, so that's the capital, which was built from scratch in the middle of nowhere. And my dad had to work for the Brazilian government as an engineer for a while because they had paid for his education. So I was born in the capital. But then we were just living in Brazil. My family is from a city called Belo Horizonte. And we spoke English in the house, and my parents were very, very strict about only speaking English in the house because we were supposed to never forget it. There was no thought of leaving Brazil, even when the economy hit a stage of hyperinflation. The month we left, inflation was 80%, just that month. Wow. So the prudent fiduciary behavior was to try to get your boss to pay you in the morning instead of the afternoon because already your paycheck is losing value, and to spend as fast as you got your money, which my parents actually had to. They knew intellectually they shouldn't behave that way in North America, but it was hard to make that switch. And Brazil hasn't had such an economically disastrous period since then, but even at the height of that, it apparently didn't even cross my dad's mind to leave Brazil. It took an American aunt of mine, one of my mom's sisters, when she was visiting, to suggest, hey, you guys might be happier up. And my dad at the same time was he wanted to change careers. So we ended up in the States sort of suddenly and unexpectedly. And I spent in Canada really for the first year, but I've spent most of my life living in the U.S.
Okay. Brazil has had a bit of a, at least when I remember, the first time I remember hearing of Brazil, it was people were looking at it as like kind of an escape route for the U.S. if the U.S. went sideways, because they had I believe they had a Catholic leader.
Okay. Are you talking about Bolsonaro?
I think that's correct.
Yeah, the Trump of the tropics.
Yes.
Right. I mean, these things sort of come in stages. So I mentioned that my mom's American, but actually she was raised in Peru. And I have family in Spanish-speaking Latin America as well. Lived in Chile for a while, and had family in Chile for a long time. The last one has just moved back to the States. But I played rugby in Chile. My son played rugby in Chile. Lots of Chile connections. including going further south in Tierra del Fuego, which is cool. So like, looking out south on an island and knowing the next thing you would see would be Antarctica.
Yeah.
But during the 2008 crash, Chile was the place. All my friends were talking about buying places in Chile, and because Chile is probably the most prosperous country in Latin America, stable economy, etc. So this is where the hip, cool, the version, like the Americans who would have been buying Dogecoin if Dogecoin had existed in 2008, the Chile was the one. And Brazil has certainly, Brazil is also, it's one of those countries that for a lot of people hits a sweet spot of the dollar goes very far. But there's also, among the countries where the dollar goes very far, there's a lot of infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
So it can be attractive in that way. Bolsonaro himself, he's actually trying to run again, and the commies are running their playbook, like with Le Pen in France, like with Trump here, trying to get him disqualified from running again. But the thing about Brazil, as opposed to, say, Nayib Bukele's, I'm not sure how political your show is, but it seemed like it was pretty political. Nayib Bukele's El Salvador. El Salvador is a wonderful success story so far, but it's also a tiny little laboratory case. It's like a few counties, right? I mean, it's awesome what he's doing, but so far. But Brazil is the size of the United States and also has an enormous population, so over 200 million. I don't think a financial paradise or a cultural paradise for Americans looking to set up shop somewhere else was really ever created. But it is. Brazil, unfortunately, has had the label of the next big thing for 100 years now, and it never really is. I think there's one big difference now, and it's the same difference that has made El Salvador what it is and ready for someone like Nayib Bukele. It's now over 30% evangelical, Protestant evangelical. Okay. So society is changing.
Right.
But until there's reformation down there, the structures are corrupt and decadent, etc.
Why do you say unfortunately?
Unfortunately
why do you say unfortunately that Brazil has been seen as kind of
yeah. Because it hasn't lived up to that promise. Okay. Right? It's embarrassing to be the country of the future for 100 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you could go search and like look for Time magazine articles or Life magazine articles or whoever, The Economist. It's been decades and decades and decades of the next big thing, and some of that was reflected in things that happened in Brazil the mid-century. Isn't like Brazilians went after this in a way. Like Brasilia is an artificial city built in the middle of nowhere because almost the whole population is on the coast, and it's this epic working man saga of how this happened, how they built it. It was shaped like an airplane. It's you can still see the outline of the airplane now. There's a lot of idealism, but not a lot of execution.
Yeah. How much of the prosperity of Brazil is tied to its Catholic roots?
I would say none at all. I would actually say that that's one of the things holding Brazil back.
Interesting.
Yeah. I think that one of the greatest legacies that the Protestant Reformation has left is its culture of work. Not its culture of productivity, but its culture of good work and of working for others. Right? This idea that you can kind of uncynically work for the good of your neighbors and therefore of society. You're not just working for yourself, although that's obviously a good thing. There's an order of operations, right? An order of loves. But the degree to which Protestants worked for their neighbors and for their cities was, as far as it went, it was sincere, it was earnest, it wasn't some idealized. And I think that Latin and Catholic culture is very much idealized. Right? This is the perfect thing we're going to strive for. But here are all the compromises we're willing to make, all the venial sins you can commit. It's really not a big deal. So it's sort of, for me, I think that expresses itself in codes of law. So, I would say that Northern European and therefore Anglo-Saxon culture tends to operate from a common law perspective. And in fact, all of the West, including Spain, Portugal, Italy, was taken over by Germanic peoples. So there's somewhat of a common law legacy throughout Europe that, all of medieval Europe adopted and sort of became one of the main reasons Europe prospered so. But kind of infiltrated into that in the south of Europe is this Roman idea, or Roman laws in the Napoleonic Code is the same way. Roman laws are perfect, and no one can fulfill them, which might remind you of some other conversations about law a Christian might have. But what that does is it creates corruption. Everyone treats laws as suggestions.
Right.
This, if we could all be this way, that'd be great. But actually, I'm going to take a shortcut. So it institutes corruption. And the Catholic Church itself, I think, in Christian living and piety, introduces that same thing with venial sin. Whereas when a pure common law society, laws are a combination of that which is best with that which people do, right? So there's a good thing, and here's when people are behaving well, these are the things they do. We're going to try to build laws that reflect that, right? So they're actually feasible.
Right. There's some level of acceptable corruption in pretty much all laws across the globe, though.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just human, right? But if you have a code that institutionalizes that,
right,
then you're going to have more problems.
Yeah. But even the Bible itself is like, you can't. There's no way we can fulfill the Bible.
No, that's right. And I wouldn't want to compare God's law with man's law.
Right.
But even with God's law, so God's law is perfect. None of us fulfill it. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And yet, God says that it is not so deep that there is no one who can swim down to it. It's not so high that there's no one who can go up to it. It's near at hand.
Right.
Right. So we shouldn't be scared of God's law. And any law of man that frightens people who just want to do well is wicked as well. We're frightened of God's law because we're wicked. Right. Mm-hmm. And I definitely would want to have a very sharp distinction between civil law and divine law. I'd want to, there are a lot of distinctions I'd want to make, but God is good. His law is good. Good rulers will have good laws, and good laws consider the frame of the doer, right? A good legislator will not make laws that the people cannot keep to.
Uphold.
Right.
Exactly. Yeah. I would assume, though, back to the Catholic Church in Brazil, the Catholic Church itself has been extremely productive, has generated a lot of successful buildings that back, in the early days of the United States, the Catholic Church was one of the main reasons why we have cities like Los Angeles and San Antonio, all of those. What is it that has changed thus that the Catholic Church is no longer that way?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that there's been a change, but more that the chickens have come home to roost. So across Latin America, colonial history, and I love that you brought up Los Angeles, colonial history is just much more ancient, right? So like Portuguese Brazilian civilization was already 100 years old by the time English speakers were even thinking of getting to the Americas. Right. And there's a lot more structure, more cities, more art, more everything. And in fact, the Catholic Church was part of the push for that. But with both the Spanish and the Portuguese, the Catholic Church was very much it was deeply entwined with the state.
Right.
And so in Europe, what we saw was the papacy losing power, right? The Pope doing silly things like dividing the world between Spain and Portugal. The Pope didn't do that because he wanted to. He did that because Spain and Portugal told him to. And so the Catholic Church, after the Reformation, my take is that the Catholic Church began to compromise with kings and with states. There's a great movie called The Mission, which is set on the border between Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil, about some Jesuits, which I highly recommend. Like that episode, basically the ejection of the Jesuits from the New World, the fall of the Jesuits, and Jesuits were founded to combat Christians like you and me, Calvinists, Reformed Christians. But they did a whole lot of good, and they were the best of what the Catholic Church had to offer. And the Catholic Church got rid of them, suppressed them. They still exist, of course, but suppressed them because they wouldn't do what Portugal and Spain wanted them to do. So there was already kind of that statist and then Enlightenment virus inside of the Roman Catholic Church that guaranteed that, although it was still great and able to build and make things, it was going to push people into statism and servitude. At the same time, throughout the world, the Catholic Church became syncretistic, right? It told Mexicans that their gods were this saint and that saint, and this goddess is Mary. It told Brazilians, it told Portuguese people the same thing. Wherever it went, it tried to make those connections, and that too, like you could have argued then that it was helping people understand the gospel to some degree, but it put a wicked seed inside what they were doing. So there are some like old line Catholics, the kind who like Latin and all that in Brazil, but they are a minority. The country is nominally Catholic.
I would assume it's similar. I had my experience in Zambia was that it is nominally Christian.
Yeah.
And that everyone says they're Christian most of the time. That doesn't mean they live out their Christian life. That they'll go to church on potentially Easter and Christmas.
Right.
And that's kind of it. They're nominally Christian.
Yeah.
They believe in God as kind of an abstract theory.
Right, exactly. And I do think that we can make, the same way we can make judgments about cultures without being jerks about it and looking for the good in everything. We can, just like with people, we can say, oh, he's good at that and he's not good at this thing. I think we can also make judgments about nominal Christianity in cultures. I would rather have even that degree of Christianity than a Raleigh pagan society.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, I believe, I don't know this, but I believe the legacy even of nominal Christianity in Zambia would be somewhat Anglican and trending toward evangelical. In Brazil, it's Catholic, and I think in the Spanish-speaking America, there are very few evangelicals, and so that kind of means that there's paganism infiltrated.
Right.
And I'm sure in Africa there's the constant struggle against
ATRs,
local indigenous.
ATR is what they call it. Yeah,
Okay.
African traditional.
Right,
Yeah.
right, exactly.
Yeah, the Catholic Church. One of its big problems when it was working through the U.S., as I remember, was that the big distinction between itself and the Protestant Church was that the Catholics were saying, "Hey, the Indians, your gods are."
Right.
XYZ saint.
That was something that they purposely did, including the Jesuits. Right. The Jesuits were the big movers in French America, and in fact, their legacy reached all the way to where we live in the United States.
Right.
Almost to the Pacific coast. The Jesuits made their way all the way out here, but they were very strong in Eastern Canada, and it was a lot of that they achieved by. And France actually had a policy, the state, the Kingdom of France, because of the Huguenots and from their perspective, negative experience with the Huguenots. They fought a civil war. They got rid of the Huguenots. They did not colonize. They kept colonization to a minimum in French America because they were afraid to lose control, which is why they lost North America. I suppose eventually the British did lose control, but the Roman Catholic Church then had the same way France dealt with the indigenous nations by negotiating and trading and treating them as nations, which the English did too, by the way. But it was strictly negotiating and relationships. Well, the Jesuits, cut a swath of conversion through what became French America, French Canada, because there was no threat of invasion, there was no population pressure. It was actually just kind of missionary work, but they had loaded it with that. Hey, these, you can keep all your gods, you just have to call them the names of saints.
What does that chicken come home to roost look like practically in Brazil?
Well, I think that it does contribute toward corruption, right? One of the things so witchcraft contributes towards corruption, and that syncretism encourages witchcraft throughout the so-called global South, including in Africa. One of the things that Christians have to deal with is the prosperity gospel, right? So you
That's
treat
a big one, yep.
you treat God like he's an ATM machine. You do X and Y, you get a car, you get a job, whatever it is, right? That's witchcraft, right? That's
Right.
That's a Christian version of witchcraft, treating God that way. It's not a
Like
relationship
an equation or something.
Was that
Like an equation?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah, you're casting a spell, and your spell results in a nice car from God. Well, the Catholic Church has been doing that for a long time, because that is what all peoples at all times have done with their minor river gods, with their household gods, with the goddess of the sea or the god of storms or whatever. You're trying to do things that will, especially with the minor gods, grant you favor. You're casting spells,
Right.
and when you do that, you introduce incentives to corruption, right? You no longer try to make the girl fall in love with you. You get your demon god to make her fall in love with you, or your saint,
Right.
right? And so it just introduces, I think, a culture of cheating and backstabbing and corruption. Those are not terms I would use as dominant descriptors of Brazilian society, but that's that little bad seed that's infiltrated.
Is that you can kind of call upon the ancient gods, either in the form of saints or in their original name,
Right.
to get things done if you need to. Is that political as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's so Brazilians are very religious, and you can talk about religious things openly. A lot of it is very new agey pagan, but it's the songs, the political speech, they're full of not only references to the saints, references directly to the two old, usually African, but old gods by name.
Oh, interesting.
The practice of African religions is widespread, completely mixed in with Catholic practices, vocabulary. It was actually odd when I lived in the south of Brazil in 2015, because it's a very European area, and not one that even Brazilians associate with spiritism and witchcraft. But then working there, supporting a CREC church down there, I was told, hey, actually this is the part of the country with the most spiritists. And I looked into it, and it was true. Because spiritists down there don't call themselves Catholics.
Got it.
They're like old line European sorcerers. And it was strange because you can talk very openly about religion down there. It was strange to talk to people I knew, maybe teammates on my rugby team or whatever. And they were, oh, well, I'm religious too, Oh, really? Oh, well, tell me about it. Well, normal stuff. I'm a spiritist. My dad was a spiritist. But the shocking thing about it was for me, how not Catholic it was. These guys were actually like European old witchcraft spiritists, had been for generations, because normally in Brazil it's completely mixed in.
Where's that come from? Is that the Portuguese?
That mix?
Yeah, no, the spiritism from Europe, is that the Portuguese influence as they immigrated over?
Yeah, yes. Some Italians as well. I think one of the things that, so I this is not something I've studied in depth. This would be lovely to hear from someone who's an expert, but it seems to me that in the south of Europe, which is far more mountainous, right? So from the Alps on down, there's a mountain range down the boot of Italy. There's a mountain range between Spain and Portugal. There are mountains in the Iberian Peninsula, mountains in Galicia, northern Portugal. In fact, there's an expression in Portuguese, traz os montes, in Portugal, to talk about the transition between Spain and Portugal. Paganism the word pagan actually means like country bumpkin. Christianity was an urban religion. And so in a lot of the hill country, witchcraft and pagan religion persisted. And then was willing to take on some sort of Catholic roots, but kept a lot of that. We see some of that in some of our own English language mythology, like witches kind of appearing in very Christian stories like Robin Hood or whatever.
Yeah.
But I think in the mountain countries even more so. And so places like Portugal and Italy had more of that, and some of it ended up in Brazil or around the empire of Portugal.
Is that anything to do with the mountains themselves?
Yeah, it creates isolation. Okay. Right?
Yeah, so you don't have contact with the outside world.
Yeah, exactly. A lot less pressure.
One of the things I was running into in Africa was when I was talking to these people about living out their Christian faith, discarding ATR, getting rid of these old pagan gods.
Yeah.
A lot of them were hesitant because they kind of thought of it as Christianity. Like Christianity was similar to Catholicism in that it just wrapped all these things in together.
Right.
And it was just another god on top of those who just happened to be the most powerful one.
Yes.
How is Christianity down in Brazil, kind of the evangelical movement, dealing with that?
Pardon me. Yeah, there's actually, in all this talk about Catholicism, believe it or not, the evangelicals have been good for the Catholics in the sense that it's helped them. There's a growing counter-Reformation movement. So the evangelicals are having a purifying effect on the country. So one example would be, there's a major evangelical conference in the northeast of Brazil every year. 100,000 people type thing. So it's a practice of evangelical churches around the country. And again, we're talking at this point over a third of the population.
Right.
So it's a very common thing, but it's just a universal practice. You do camps or retreats during Carnival, especially if you live near an area where there is Carnival. Because evangelicals don't do Carnival.
Carnival being
like Mardi Gras.
Okay.
But times 10. Like whatever debauchery you think New Orleans is capable of, it's nothing compared to just a street corner carnival in Brazil. People travel from around the world to go to Brazilian carnivals. Sorry. But this town is an example. This is a town that has this conference, and it was actually chosen as a sort of retreat. It's like a resort area. At this point, there is now no carnival in this city. It's not a tiny city. Like the thing they do during Carnival is host this mega conference. But that sort of exists all around the country, where a negative person might see, well, the evangelicals are being party poopers, but a lot of this party, it's exactly. So there's the negative side, the negative view of Puritans that people have, which is completely false. That thing that people are afraid of, the evangelicals are doing in Brazil, and it's good for the country.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and some of it comes from poor theological reasoning, like a lot of them think you can't drink and that kind of thing. But a lot of it is also a reaction to the extreme excess of the society around them. I actually forget the original question. I apologize.
No, you're fine. I was just curious, how is the evangelical movement working its way through the culture? What
Right. So I mean, at this point, I mean, like there's we're talking about 40 years since the evangelical explosion began.
Right.
So at this point, it's infused in politics and less so in the arts and culture, high culture, because there's been the socialist march to the institutions. The universities are controlled, but even there, we're seeing more and more movie making, whatever. Like it is now to the point where leaders in every field in Brazil, include evangelicals among them, and it's unlike here the default easy Christianity. So there are parts of the country, the Midwest, the South, where the best thing to be is a Christian.
Right.
Like if you want to be a real estate agent, it's best to go to First Baptist.
Yeah, there's some cultural
reward, really. Yeah. That wouldn't be the case here in our part of the country, but well, in Brazil, that thing is Catholic. So this, Brazil is and now has the same percentage of evangelicals and conservative Protestants as the United States does. Like people who actually go to church, same percentage. But there, it's a self-selecting population. They have not taken the easy path.
Right.
Right. Well, and of course, I'm already talking about people who go to church, but that's still present in the U.S. People go to church, but they're not really, passionate about the gospel. They don't want to build up the kingdom of Christ. Now, what's lacking in Brazil is knowledge about the next steps, practical knowledge. That's Protestants do things for themselves, and they don't. So there's a huge growing homeschooling movement, classical education movement. There's more entrepreneurship, despite all the hostile laws. But there's also, so there's a lot more eagerness, but there's also a lot more just plain old ignorance. Like we don't know how to do these things, right. which is a big motivation for my ministry, because I have a media ministry to Brazil, and I just want to make things that helps Brazilian families live out their Christian lives.
Understand next steps.
Right. Exactly right.
Yeah. Is the future of Brazil kind of moving down the path? Maybe a better way of asking this is, how do you see that overtaking Catholicism in the next 10 years?
Well, the demographic predictions are that in the next 10 years, the country will be over 40% evangelical, which will be an enormous blessing. But I also think that we're going to start getting into territory of that cultural Christianity, and things will start to slow down a little bit. I would like to see evangelicals and Protestants building more and more institutions and things that can support a Christian society, a Protestant society. The Catholic Church, I think, is just going to continue drifting. It's even easy for me to imagine the politically very conservative, traditional Catholics who are, really effectively a tiny group. They are vocal in some areas like homeschooling, but I could see them sort of being co-opted by the bigger, just to push the energy of this upcoming Protestant society. But there are some big barriers still in the way, a lot of fighting ahead. Socialism is deeply infiltrated. The Supreme Court down there is basically running the country now. They hate Christians, actively persecute them. People, so, the Trump of the tropics, Bolsonaro, he is being tried, and they're trying to get him, convicted with something that'll stop him from running for president. The Workers' Party has collapsed, which is excellent, but the Supreme Court is still there. Anyone who is a teacher is a communist. The Ministry of Education has a lot of power and is extremely intrusive. So really, to me, the great fight in Brazil, as here in the United States, but it's the same fight, but there's a possibility of mistaking the enemy. Catholicism is, I guess it's sort of at this point
less of the enemy.
Yeah, exactly right. It's global communism, it's socialism, it's statism.
Right.
It's man as God.
The WEF, World Economic Forum.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Is evangelicalism seen at in any way as kind of a class distinctionary? It's a richer person thing, or it's a poorer person?
It's a poorer person thing.
Okay.
Like I think in a lot of this surge in Christianity across the global South. I mean, it's different in Brazil than a lot of other places because Brazil is the West. But that's starting to change. The Reformed. So there have been Presbyterian churches in Brazil for 150 years and more. But they weren't the big boom. The big boom was Pentecostals, Assemblies of God types. But the church is looking more and more to the Reformed Church, which itself has grown. It's grown along with everything else. And those churches, as here in the United States, often are quite middle class. But no, there's no association of Christianity itself or evangelicalism with any particular class. It's across the board.
Across the board, and is there equal political distribution?
No. So I mean, among the poorer classes, even among evangelicals, there is more support for the Workers' Party and people who want to write welfare checks and have social programs, right? But even there, it's the overwhelming tendency is for evangelicals to be conservative. So I expect Brazil to become more conservative in the future. There's already reason to be optimistic. The Workers' Party has truly collapsed. It has no more support.
And that's just a socialist party?
Right, okay. Exactly. And it's sort of the default, if I'm poor, I vote for them.
Right.
But over the they've had the most power over the last 20 years by far. But you could also see signs of it creaking. I believe they've collapsed. The Supreme Court is still so powerful. So there's a guy, one of the main judges there, Alexandre de Moraes. The New York Times even wrote about him a few years ago about how corrupt and abusive he was. And for the New York Times to do that, you can only imagine.
Got to be something special.
Right. So Brazil had a January 8th, a year after the American January 6th. Same thing. Election interference. And actually, unlike, so you can create these layers of verifiability. In Brazil, it was obvious because all the same complaints that Trump supporters might have had were present. But on top of that, everyone could see certain things being done in the open before the election. Forget miscounting or messing with ballot boxes or whatever. Every time Bolsonaro would try to put out a new ad campaign, a new commercial, this one judge, Moraes, would call it fake news and prohibit it from airing. But just like here, the right was killing him on podcasts and all this stuff that Moraes couldn't control, which is why Moraes is at war with Elon Musk now. I don't know if you've picked up any of that,
yeah.
But
he's at war with a lot of people.
Yes, yeah, he is. But yeah, so there's despite that, I expect the country to turn conservative. The problem with that is that, in the United States, there are different ways of being so-called right-wing or conservative. I don't find either one of those terms ideal. And this is not meant to be a Jesus juke or holier than thou, but I prefer to use gospel or ecclesiastical language instead of centering on this Enlightenment concept of right and left that comes from the French Revolution. But we also have to just live in the world and talk.
Right.
Because and this actually, what I'm about to say is kind of illustrates why I don't love all this terminology. But here, conservatives, the right, there are different ways of being that way, but there's a deep tradition of decentralization of power, of balance of power, that does not exist in Latin America.
Interesting.
Right. So you have it's funny because I talked to my pastor, Ben Zorns. He says all the Brazilians he knows are libertarians. That's because he's on X. There's plenty of that and it's growing. But the default way of being is statist.
Right.
You're either a commie statist or you're a family and tradition statist.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see that is beginning to fragment as evangelicalism grows, but it's still when it's hard to break that thinking. Homeschooling's exploding, and yet still it's not just soft evangelicalism, it's just Latinness and Brazilianness. Yeah, sure, the government can educate our kids. That makes sense. The government does everything.
Right.
So we'll see how that goes.
Overdependence on government.
Right.
A big problem, especially in poorer countries.
And not just dependence for Brazilians. There is plenty of that, but also just a sense of rightness, right? The state, and if you think about the Kingdom of Portugal, the Kingdom of Spain, they were actively centralizing powers. Now, even before the Reformation, England was remarkable for the power that its nobles had, right? And for how powerful its parliament was. So there's a long history of decentralization. So it's not just the dependence, it's the actual belief that it's good. This is the way to make the world better isn't to take power away from the state. It's to make the state good. This is the thinking, right? Yeah. Because of course the state is all encompassing. That's what the state is. It's a very Roman way of thinking.
Right. Yeah. X has been almost banned.
It's been banned a few times and then come back.
Banned. Yeah. What is kind of because Moreno, what's his name?
Moraes
sees Elon as a potential threat.
Yeah.
What's the path forward for getting him out of office? Is it a full lifetime?
There have been, by the way, X is far from the only thing that Moraes and his cronies have knocked down, as we say in Portuguese. WhatsApp, which is the primary way Brazilians communicate, has been fined and taken off the air multiple times. Instagram, whatever, anyone who makes them mad. What do they use
besides WhatsApp?
That's it.
So there's just no communication.
There's not even text messaging is not a thing.
Oh yeah.
It's all WhatsApp. That's right. So they were willing, to bring down any online communication among Brazilians because, according to them, there were online militias, they call them, which are those right wingers who disseminate fake news. But so as far as the path forward, what was the path forward with
for getting Moraes out of office?
Oh yes, right.
For kind of undoing the corruption in government.
So that's starting. There's starting to be enough political momentum with the fragmentation of the Workers' Party, a growing center which is kind of spineless, but it does. It's a signal that the Workers' Party has lost some support. So it makes it a little easier for legislators. There have already been a couple of attempts. Completely failed to impeach Moraes. But that possibility exists legally.
Okay.
And I think it may actually happen sometime in the next couple of years.
Okay, interesting. Why do you say next couple of years? What's the indicators you're looking at?
That you need to have a certain majority of votes, and I don't know what it is. But there are elections next year. and I think that the rightist parties are gaining more power. The center is becoming less afraid of Moraes and what he can do. And so if the Workers' Party loses anymore, then there may actually be enough to move enough of the people in the center over to vote to bring him down.
Yeah.
Now it's still like it's not. He is the big enemy right now.
The big E on the eye chart, but he's not all of the letters.
Exactly. There's still like he has plenty of cronies, and pretty much anyone who works for the government, as opposed to being a politician, that's a separate animal. Anyone who works for the government, just like here, but even more so, is deeply socialist.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that includes our judges at every level, just like our teachers. If Brazilian teachers are all socialist, how much more the judges? So there's a deep problem there, but.
And it feels like the government is a little more open about the socialist program that they're running. Here, it's kind of a little bit put in the dark. It's kind of grown a little popularity, grown a little bit.
Right.
It's poked its head out of the water. But there, it feels a little bit like almost, what are you going to do about it?
Yeah, there definitely is that. There's also a lot of blindness as to what statism and socialism is, right? So there is the stuff that's clearly labeled as you bring up, but then we see plenty of this in the States where the people just don't examine, why is the government doing this particular thing, right? Why aren't we doing it? Why isn't the family doing it? Why isn't the church doing it? Why is the government doing this? It just seems natural that the government should be. And then, of course, it's the water and the frog thing, and the water gets hotter and the frog doesn't jump out.
Yeah. Is there a growing... is what the homeschool movement is creating. And also, I talked to Jeff Calhoun a couple weeks ago, who's with Tactical Civics. It's kind of idea that we should be using the things that the government gave us originally, that the founding fathers gave us, to kind of limit the power of government. Is there anything similar to that happening in Brazil?
So the Brazilian civic structure has no real guarantee of liberty or rights beyond the very nebulous French Revolution human rights.
Okay,
right?
Got it.
So that kind of connects with that Anglo-Saxon tradition of decentralization and balance that doesn't exist. That concept doesn't really exist. So no, there's nothing to go back to or to pull up from the depths to use as a weapon. And I think I think Brazilians are in a much more raw situation in which I think it's the church that's going to come to the political rescue of Brazil, and it's going to have to be strictly looking forward. I think Americans who say that there's a lot that's worth saving from our own structures because they were built by Christians definitely have a case.
Right.
That creates its own problems. Like maybe you're looking backward too much because we could make a new thing if we need to.
Right.
But the Brazilians have no choice.
It's basically you got to tear it down and build something new.
Right.
It feels like Brazil is kind of in this this juxtaposition where it's very different from the rest of Latin America.
Yes, yes.
And it also feels like a lot of the people in Brazil are more American thinking, in a way that they're kind of like, we don't really love the government. They're kind of thinking about these things more. It's a little more Western focused. And then the government in Brazil seems a little more European, in that you mentioned they're limiting restrictions on speech because they don't want people to be online misinformation.
Right.
Something that we're seeing happen all over England at the moment.
Yeah.
They're impeaching the hopefully incoming new leader, somewhat like Le Pen in France. There's this kind of forces all pulling all over the place.
Yeah. I think Brazil, it's a lot of Americans don't think of Brazil as the West, but Brazil is having the same, they are having the great war over the West that everyone else is having. The United States, Canada, England, Sweden,
Right.
and all losing to one degree or another. But I recently gave a talk at our church's missions conference, and it actually revolved around this idea. I think the last two great bastions of the West are the United States and Brazil. As a gospel believing Christian, I'm okay with the West dying because the kingdom of God will advance. But I don't want the West to die. It's beautiful.
Right. Yeah.
And it's worth fighting for, and we can all die on this battlefield, and that would be beautiful too. I'd rather win though. So, and as far as the differences of Brazil and the rest of Latin America go, there are some Spanish-speaking Latin American countries that are profoundly Western or were. So I would put in that list countries like Chile, Argentina, Colombia.
Yeah.
And then there are others that from the beginning, from their inception, were profoundly not Western or layered over with Westernness. A lot of that just had to do with just raw populations, like Mexico and Peru,
Right.
millions upon millions and millions of indigenous, right? So it was never going to be a European society. It was going to be a converted indigenous society.
And because the Catholics converted, there was a lot of indigenous still in that conversion.
Still in the conversion, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's, besides the language thing, so Brazilians are not Hispanic because they're not from Hispania and they don't speak Hispanish. But they, of course, are Latin American. But if you say, with that, I mean, people from Quebec would be Latin American. Suriname would, or Dutch Guiana would not be Latin America. So there are just different ways of conceiving and labeling all these things. But Lusitanian Portuguese civilization and then Brazilian civilization is distinct enough from Spanish civilization. And then they followed their diverging paths that, Brazil is certainly unique in the Americas.
Do you see it following a similar path that the U.S. is currently following a year or two behind?
There's a lot of that, and there are a lot of jokes, in Brazilian society about Brazilians doing things 15 years after Americans do them, good or bad. I suppose it might depend on what you're trying to get to with that question, because I think that. So you and I are part of one of many movements and communities within American Christendom that is very dynamic and energetic. But the church is decadent, right? And that is, I would say, is the overall movement. That's fundamentally different from what's happening in Brazil. The church may be weaker down there right now, but it's on the ascendancy.
It's alive.
Yeah, and moving up. We're moving down. And so I actually really don't know how to predict it. Objectively, I think Christianity and Protestant Christendom down there is weaker. And they don't even, they're often so confused about which direction to turn to fight. They have a lot of the same ineffectiveness as we do, but they're growing up, and we are growing old, and that's an important difference.
Yeah, Moraes obviously sees Elon as a threat. Is there how much of the U.S.'s hand is on Brazil?
You're going to get a lot of different answers to that. And Moraes and his ilk have certainly used the concept of American interference in Brazil as justification, but like the specter of it, because of course the Americans who have interfered the most in Brazil have been the Democrats, and Democrats when they're in power, and Biden. I mean, the USAID thing. I think if you talk to anyone who has loyalties to a country not the United States, who's a Christian, like Lennox Califungua here in town, he's given several talks recently about the problems with USAID and all that. I think we were all relieved.
Yes.
I mean, I would be willing to make the case, so Bolsonaro losing that election Morais actively suppressing his success, it wasn't just Morais. American money went into putting socialists in power in Brazil.
Right.
So yeah, it's certainly present. Pardon me. I think it can be easy sometimes to overestimate the effect that the United States has, but then there are these insidious little ways that are hard to measure that American empire has affected the world, and in my opinion, usually for ill.
Yeah. If the Trump of the South were to get in, do you think he would follow a similar program that Trump is following as far as the dismantling of the government?
Well, no, I don't. Perhaps he would take inspiration from it. He was in power once before. Yeah, so his name is Bolsonaro. He may. I think that Brazilians are a lot less fed up with that sort of thing as Americans were. And Brazil is not spending money hand over fist in other countries. I mean, they do, but nowhere near what the United States does. And when they do, it's usually very openly communist. Like if socialists are in charge in Brazil, all of a sudden, Cuba and Mozambique and Angola get all these programs. Empty airports are built. Just things that are not used. And that stops this because basically it's just all PR. But compared to the United States, it's just a drop in the bucket. So Americans had a lot more reason to be fed up, I suppose. So I don't think there would be such a program of slash and burn, of austerity. But I would expect, as before, some sort of contraction of the government. But he's like Trump. He's a populist. He is Roman Catholic. His wife is an evangelical, which is interesting. So I've been told that the presidential palace during his first term, all the statues of saints were removed.
Oh, interesting.
Because of her.
Ah.
Which is fascinating. A fascinating sign of his willingness to work with evangelicals. Yeah. His base are evangelicals.
Yeah.
That being said, I think it's likely that the Supreme Court will succeed and that he will not be able to run. And instead, he'll sort of godfather the movement into the next candidates.
Yeah. Yeah. But even Argentina had they were
Milei.
Right. Milei, they were not as much as the U.S. giving out handfuls of cash to the world.
But Milei is a different animal. Milei is famously extremely libertarian. Bolsonaro is not that.
Yeah.
And Trump is not. Bolsonaro. You could really compare Bolsonaro to Trump in his kind of view of the world. Trump is taking all these radical steps, I think, because he is seeing, in his mind, misallocation. Whereas Milei is ideologically driven. Like the government should not do these things. Right. Yeah. It's not about the government having managed things badly or being corrupt or being wasteful. It's about the government shouldn't even touch this stuff anyway.
Right.
So it's a different motivation, and there's no figure like that in Brazilian politics right now.
But it sounds like that could be helpful. You mentioned the Ministry of Education is wildly overpowered.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. I'm not sure if anytime soon there will be the political clout to bring down the Ministry of Education. I'm shocked that Trump is willing to talk about doing it here. But the Brazilian one
did close it.
A little bit. I think it may have been exactly. I think some things may be up in the air right now. I'm not sure about that, but the Brazilian Ministry of Education is a behemoth. I mean, as big as the American one is, and all its complicity with teachers' unions, and I mean, it's an ugly thing. It is, the Brazilian Ministry of Education puts that
percentage-wise is much larger.
Well, yeah, as far as and institutional reach,
right?
And in fact, one of the political heroes of Brazil is a man named Paulo Freire, who is seen as like the founder of modern Brazilian education. And actually, there's been a lot of interesting work in English recently, a lot of very good podcasts and documentaries about this man, because Americans are starting to realize he all this woke education stuff started in the 80s.
Mhm.
And so those people at Harvard or wherever, they were studying Paulo Freire.
Interesting. Okay.
So there are Brazilian roots to the bad educational stuff going up here. Yeah.
Awkward.
Yeah, sure
Yeah.
is.
Yeah.
So it'll be hard to get rid of that particular octopus.
Yes. Is there a kind of, because Brazil is so big, different, and the terrain, as I understand, is kind of all over the place.
Yes, exactly.
Are there similar to Europe, still outliers of pagan tribes, things that are just completely different politically, culturally, social, economically, all over Brazil?
Sorry, I don't understand the question.
Yeah. Are there is all of Brazil kind of could be combined um, similar to a country in Europe, or is it more similar to America in
Oh,
that you've got things like the Midwest and you've got
yeah.
the East Coast and the West Coast and things like that?
Yeah, I think that, if you're speaking demographically, the best comparison is the United States, just in the sense of diversity. The geographical diversity is important. It's an enormous country, so there's no, it could never be European. It's multi-ethnic. It massively multi-ethnic. It's there are cowboys. I mean, and there are several cowboy cultures like here. There are the Western cowboys, the Southern cowboys, the desert cowboys, and they're in different, like on different sides of the country. There's a third of the country is jungle, and most of the country hasn't been there, because it'd be like going to Alaska at the same time. There are huge cities in the middle of those jungles. That it's just a lot of enormous cities that put American cities, they just pale in comparison, size wise. So I think the best comparison in the world, just to understand the variety of cultures, would be the United States. But that takes someone who knows the United States, because a lot of people kind of create a mental monolith of with their picture of the United States. If you talk to a European, all Americans are a certain way, and they have no clue. And it's the same with Brazil. I will say that so my last 2 years as a kid in Brazil, I went to an American school. My mom started teaching there, and so I went to the school for free, and we had a really weird class. It's a strange concept. A class called social studies. I was in 5th and 6th grade, and in social studies, I learned that the United States was a melting pot.
Yeah,
and I was really looking forward to seeing that. And then I got here and I realized, at 12, 13, I could see that. It's not a melting pot. It's a patchwork. It's a quilt.
right.
Brazil is much more of a melting pot. It's still a patchwork and a quilt, because that's how people are. But there's a lot more mixing, a lot less separation. Exactly right. But still, it's not. It's still an enormously variegated society. Yeah.
Does the culture of community in Brazil play into that?
Yeah, play into the
melting pot as opposed to patch quilt.
Yeah, probably. Brazilians, I think, are naturally more social. I mean, I think the without thinking of in terms of any Latin culture that a viewer might be familiar with, I think the closest corollary would be like the culture of the Deep South. Front porches, friendliness, that kind of thing. So Brazilians are more social. It's not, block parties or people just hanging out all day. There's a guitar, there's a grill going, that kind of thing, without idealizing it and saying it's all over the place, or that, video games and other, just isolation, modern isolation hasn't been growing. I mean, if you want to watch sad movies about modern isolation, Latin Americans are the best at it. So, of course, those things are there, the sadness of urban life when you don't have connection. But all that being said, Brazilians are more social and more connected. So that probably has played into it. But from the beginning, the Portuguese mixed with people, and that lots of ethnicities were. So like the places that eventually became the big cities were trading posts, and people would come and go, indigenous nations, other Europeans, whatever. There was just a lot of movement, a lot of interaction between Spanish civilization and Portuguese civilizations, just lots of mixing. And I also have sort of a pet theory. I think that Catholics had an easier time just mixing with other people groups and starting families or whatever than Protestants did, because of each civilization's justification for slavery. All right, Catholics are, and this may be like, you may even want to cut all this, depending on how far afield this is from where you want to go with this podcast. But Catholics are much more comfortable with venial sin and with the world is broken and we're just gonna, this is just life.
Right.
So they didn't feel like they had to justify slavery. Protestants felt like they had to, if we're going to do this, there has to be
there's an intrinsic, they think this is wrong.
Right, exactly. So Catholics are much more with it. We're just doing wrong things. I cheat on my wife and I shouldn't do that, but it's a few more years in purgatory, slavery the same way. But if we're Protestants, we have to justify it. And so these people are way too other. Maybe they're not even human, but right? These people are way too other. And so I think that actually created a civilizational drift where Catholics were a lot more willing to just mix or whatever, and a lot of Protestants weren't.
Yeah, the concept of the Catholic versus Protestant dealing with slavery. I was talking to Mark Wilson. He has this idea of a country's original sin, and that the U.S. is kind of our thing that is always kind of in the back of our mind as the thing we always did wrong,
right?
Slavery. And he talked about England. He was like, English people always have this idea that the empire, their conquest of the world was wrong, and they're always trying to kind of make amends for that.
Right.
Is there something similar like that in Brazil?
I mean, I might be curious about what some of my friends might have to say, but to be honest, I don't think so. I think the Brazilian crisis. So there's a saying, the problem with Brazil is Brazilians. So if anything, I think there's a bit of self-hatred over our own corruption. But, there's not really, I don't think there's like a national sin that haunts from the past. There was the War of the Triple Alliance. There have been a lot of academic arguments made, some more or less convincing, to frame it as a genocide in Paraguay. So in the 1860s. So Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay went to war with Paraguay. Paraguay had this dictator who would not surrender, and a lot of Paraguayans died. There have definitely been attempts to make that a national sin, because it's very handy for the communists to have a national sin you can hold over people.
Right. Yep.
And that is not a comment on the validity of arguing that it was genocidal or not. I'm not commenting on that.
Yeah.
Simply on the fact that there has been an attempt to make it that way. But, I think part of the reason there's even been that attempt is that there's no such national sin in Brazil. The United States, Brazil, Germany, Russia, China, they have to wrestle with having at one point or another been some kind of preeminent power. And having had the potential to abuse that. Brazil's never really had that, perhaps internally,
right. But there's no outward working in the same way that England or America or something like that.
Right.
Yeah, that makes sense. What is the drug and criminal situation?
Out of control, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's In some degree, these things kind of come in waves, but all the waves are big. There's a lot of impunity, like so just no punishing.
Yeah.
And so in some places, like in Rio, it's just open war. I remember a few years ago, this is at the height of the Syrian civil war, which was 8 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
There were more murders in Brazil than there were war deaths in Syria. So there's a lot of violent crime, and a lot of people have stories, and it shapes the society. The population is also disarmed now. So about 25 years ago, Brazilians were disarmed. There's open war between criminals and the police. So a few years ago, there was a man rampaging through Dallas, killing cops.
Yep.
That is just life in Brazil.
Brazil.
Like if people know you're a cop, if the bad guys know you're a cop, they'll try to kill you just because you're a cop. Like there's no other purpose to it. Like than that you're a cop, you're an enemy soldier.
Right. Does that work its way through the cities, or is that kind of on the outskirts?
No, it's in the cities.
Okay.
That being said, like outskirts is an interesting phrase because we're in the United States, we have the inner cities, and that's kind of understood to be the more dangerous areas where gangs operate.
Right.
In Latin America, generally, not just in Brazil, the equivalent concept is actually the periphery. So downtown, the center, that's where the nice things are, and the bad neighborhoods, the gangs, they operate in the periphery,
like the suburbs.
The
suburbs.
Well, they're not suburbs really. They're a lot of slums and informal towns, but they're on the edge of the city.
Yeah.
And it's not like they're removed from the city. They're just there's never been the urban flight, right? Americans all wanted to leave the city and go create this suburban ideal that started becoming popular. That's never happened in Brazil.
Yeah.
So the poorer and working population gets pushed out or builds around the edges, and then that's where.
Is that drug operation? I would assume it's mostly drugs, correct? Drugs,
Yeah,
human trafficking.
that's right.
Is that working its way towards the U.S. or is that kind of internal?
It's internal because there's no production.
Right. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, it's all internal. It's all about dealing. And it is the big thing to deal with in criminality in Brazil is the drug trade, but it's not like with Colombia or Mexico or different points in history, drugs have made their way through the U.S. No, it's actually a destination, for drugs. So it's more about being able to sell to what Brazilians would call the playboys or the bourgeois. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. Yeah. And is it working its way? Can you kind of related to this? Can you explain the concept of a favela?
Yeah, and it's definitely connected to what I just said. Fundamentally, because things can get romanticized, right? So fundamentally, a favela is simply a slum. It's,
right.
But it can range from all sorts of things. It could be a shanty town. Cardboard and corrugated. Or it could be an informally built neighborhood or town with, a surprising amount of infrastructure. There's favela tourism.
Right. Yeah.
And so, it's because there are a lot of different ways you could describe a favela. It's just the word for slum, but it's just become kind of romanticized a lot outside of Brazil. So, people might.
It's like it's living the simple life.
Yeah. That or super dangerous criminal place, and both those things have elements of truth. So if you want to actually just get a visual of what, kind of like developed quote unquote favela might be like, and I suppose, which would be it's very different from slums, say in India or parts of Africa, usually. There's a movie. It's a movie that's way better than its title suggests. called Elite Troop. That's the title in English. And it's about, so in 1998, the Pope went to visit Brazil, and he was insisting on speaking at a certain place, which was near one of these slums, one of these favelas. And the government of Rio was afraid that he might, not that someone would try to assassinate the Pope, but that he might catch a stray round.
It's not personal. It's just the way
Right.
that it is. Yeah.
So there was this, this year-long operation to suppress crime in that particular slum, and it's basically war. Like these guys, there are special forces down there that are like Israeli level. Most of the cops are just bums, but like there are units that are commandos.
Legit. Yeah.
And they go up the hill is the expression, because most of these slums are on hills in cities. So that movie, it's an action. It definitely has a big political element. And I think one that most of your viewers probably approve of, for whatever that's worth, as a police film, and the state versus criminality. Very interesting story, but you can watch it and kind of get an idea of what these informal towns look like. And I call them informal in the sense that a lot of them, and some of them never even, some of these informal towns never turn into slums, never turn into favelas. So it's actually quite common for, a city's growing, and the city government has to open up a certain area and say it can be developed, but people don't always wait. Right, they just they siphon off power from some nearby like official city services. They start building pipes. The first couple of houses that went up, people were living without electricity and water, but they were, they'd rather do that near the city than out wherever they were from. And then things starts growing. And eventually, the formal services start coming by, private and public. Like, so suddenly there's cable TV and satellite TV, but the city, the neighborhood, the area was already built up, but all hodgepodgey and mixed, and no building codes. And some of those places turn into slums, but some of them just become working class neighborhoods. It sort of depends on how you define them.
Right.
Yeah.
It seems like an odd juxtaposition between that and then a complete reliance on government to do all of a lot of the
right. So they're parallel societies, and some of them the state has no power or only enters to make war. And this is gangs around the world always do this, but they buy your loyalty because they do good things for you, right? So the Mexican cartel, one of their guys gets killed, their mom gets money as if they were in the military, right? They'll build a bridge, they'll pay a hospital bill. And so a lot of these places in Brazil are actually run by a parallel state, a parallel government. And some of them have been wrested away from the control of drug dealers by militias.
Interesting.
Which then usually descend into criminality themselves.
Yeah.
But the criminality they tend toward, because they're not of traffic, as they say. So they kidnap and they rob and they take bounties, but they still end up abusing their people usually. And both the militias and the gangs build bridges because the city won't get around to it. A lot of these places are absolute parallel states.
And these are private militias, correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
And they're sometimes from outside. Like, not from like another state or something, but they're not from the neighborhood, but they see an opportunity to. So there's ideology mixed in. And the biggest gangs, they exercise none of this, but they, like one of them is called the Red Command, right? So communists in prisons in the 60s. There's nothing communist about them. But there's still this ideology of us against the state from them. And the militias are nowhere near as big as the thing with gangs. It's just an interesting phenomenon that they'll take over whole areas.
How safe is it for the people who actually live in the slums?
Well, there's huge variation there as well. I mean, there are actual safe favelas.
Yeah. But as far as the ones under
right,
gang control.
which in a place like Rio would be all of them,
right.
right? And this starts to drift outside my areas of expertise, but one of the things I emphasize to people when talking about, often just elsewhere in the world, is life goes on, right? Even in countries where there is war, like actual war between states or militias or whatever. So, like in Beirut, life goes on. Most of life is still. And then there's a noteworthy story when peace came to Syria. There was a story about this guy who reopened his pistachio ice cream shop that his family had always owned. But it's so, and the same thing happens in Brazil, without wanting to minimize any of the precariousness of it or the violence or the abuse. People continue living,
Right.
And so there's still commerce, and there's still kids going to school or not. I mean, and it's again, like, terrible things happen.
Yeah.
But at the same time, people still go to work, and it's just, they just live under abusive people, and everything is that much harder, right? And very often it would not be any easier if the gangs were gone.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of gangs seem to operate, as you mentioned, as a pseudo government, and there seems to be some level of almost fairness.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely want to walk the line. They are motivated to not push people to the point of rebelling. That being said,
They'll push pretty far.
yeah, I mean, there's no one wants to get shot in the back of the head.
It's not.
So they can get away with a lot, and where like and they there's also like the PR side of the gangs, right? Like where the city fills in potholes, they're just doing their job. The gang fills in potholes, they have a party, right? I mean, like,
Yeah.
they pay a hospital bill, they trumpet it from the rooftops,
Right.
right? I mean, like, it's I by no means want to suggest that these entities are filling a vacuum positively. Not even the militias do that. Right. Sometimes they do. With the militias, at least, you see often a little bump, but then, I mean, then human nature kicks in, and the fact that they have absolute power where they are, where the police won't come in there. Yeah.
Yeah. Are the gangs? Who are they celebrating for? Like, are they trying to get more people on their side, or is it just kind of a show of?
Yeah, I think it's it's a lot like the Roman patronage system, right? Yeah, you're buying loyalty.
Okay.
And where the government will tax, the federal government or the city government will tax everybody, and then everyone gets a welfare check. Not even the biggest drug gangs can do that, but they can sure throw a barbecue for you, which is what the Roman patrons did.
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're going to feed you, and you're going to vote for me.
Right. Is there a concern that, at least from the drug side of things, that if Protestant evangelicalism continues, that corruption that the Catholic state was more or less okay with would diminish, and thus the government might become less favorable or less open to the idea of gangs running these favelas or running their cities?
I mean, it's going to be a tough nut to crack, but the evangelical church is openly an enemy of these organizations. Now, there are a lot of evangelicals under their thumb, and it's not one of those things where they prohibit you from being evangelical, but basically because they can't.
Yeah.
At this point, but I do think that I think the more the evangelical church establishes itself in Brazil, the more these parallel states will start to shrink and influence. It's obviously a lot harder to drive the drug dealers from the favelas than it is to drive Carnival out of town, and even that's not done yet, right? But there is a whole cultural push that is having an effect. I'm optimistic about that. The first thing that needs to happen is impunity needs to go away. So whatever problems we think we have here in the States of repeat offenders, and it pales in comparison to what happens in Brazil. So you can commit all sorts of atrocities and never see any jail time,
Right.
which is what then leads to war.
Yeah.
So there hasn't been a scandal revolving around this for many years, but that is why these police, that police hit squads, and Brazilian ones have been famous in the past, emerge, right? Well, it's like these guys murder willy-nilly. You can't put anyone in jail if they're under 18. And so, of course, all your assassins are under 18. Same thing as throughout the world that happens if you have a law like that. Next thing you know, these
Police get
hit
fed up.
squads are, exactly. Anyway, so that's just an example. That's just to show how pervasive the impunity is. So I think once impunity goes away, then there's a chance for political change. But impunity will not go away as long as Brazilians are swallowing the United Nations human rights based on humanness agenda.
Yeah. Or money, for that matter.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. But there hasn't been any physical pushback from the gangs on the evangelical church, like
No.
the shutting down of churches, the execution of pastors, things like that. That's not happening.
No, every gangster's mom would would be in danger. Yeah, I mean, their moms go to the Assemblies of God.
That is funny. So the personal conflict.
Yeah.
That's funny. Yeah. What's the as far as getting impunity established, and is there any sort of El Salvadorian protocol that's being looked at?
I mean, it would take someone like Bolsonaro being back in charge to look at it. I don't think so. I don't think Brazilians are quite ready for that degree of radicality. I also think that it seems impractical to me to do it in a country as big as Brazil. I think to Brazilians there would seem even more impractical. I mean, one of the things that has made this work in El Salvador is how contained
small.
the country is.
Yeah.
Which, again, is not to talk down the accomplishment.
No, it's very impressive, and I would love it to see that kind of thing exported throughout the world.
I think it's fascinating that Bukele is actually offered, and now he is, like renting out prison services to the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, and it feels like there would need to be, at least from what you're telling me, more significant realization of the problem for them to actually culturally think this kind of thing would be good. So
there's full realization of the gravity of violent crime and lots of vocality about it, lots of noise making. I don't think there's realization of the roots quite yet. But the church is starting to give answers.
Yeah. What are you and your ministry doing to kind of further where are you guys pushing?
So we're pushing more. We've just now been talking a lot of the things that need to be the cracks that need to be repaired. We're pushing more towards the things that haven't been built yet. So our big focus is Christian families. A lot of Christians, so we're an education and media ministry. And a lot of such ministries will focus, for example, on Christian leadership, pastoral training, whatever. A lot of what we produce could be useful for that, but our focus is on families and helping fathers and families understand what the next steps are, how they can contribute to the health of their church, how they can educate their kids, how they can worship, even things like we take for granted that we have 500 years of reformational hymnody and psaltery, and well, that's that needs to be built, right? That doesn't
Right.
exist. Catholics don't really sing congregationally, and what they do, they take from us. So, there's just at every element of Christian living and reformational Protestant Christian living, Brazilian Christians kind of encounter that. And we are focused on the Reformed. We produce Reformed material because I think that's what the Reformed Church has to offer. What my own denomination in Brazil has to offer is that through the fingertips, concrete thinking about the kingdom of God. So when you proclaim the gospel, Jesus saves, and Jesus saves the world. Right? So it's going to mean things for your kids, for your kids' kids. It's going to mean things, therefore, for your street, for your city, for your society, and it's going to mean practical things. So it's gospel thinking to think about building a school.
Right.
You have no idea how, and I'd like to
help you out.
To help with that, right?
How are you guys, as you're seeking to build these new institutions that have not yet even been thought of, doing so in a way that does not deny, but maybe undermine the Brazilianness of this Christianity?
That's a great question. I think that's one of the things that evangelicals in Brazil are having to work through. And I think sometimes part of the attraction of the gospel as proclaimed by evangelicals is its un-Brazilianness. The problem with Brazil is Brazilians. But I don't think that is... I think you're just inserting another virus there.
It's not feasible long term.
Right.
Because eventually they'll be like, we want Brazil. We like Brazil.
Right. Exactly. Or you'll just never work for the good of Brazil.
Yeah.
So that is something I want to help foster. So, for example, one of the things I'd like to do this coming year is create a lot of biographies of Protestant saints who don't come from the English-speaking or German-speaking world. There aren't a lot of Portuguese speaking stories to tell, but I still think it would help with that sense of identity to hear of all the Italian and French and Spanish speaking saints from the era of the Reformation, since I'm talking to Reformed Christians, to kind of help Brazilians not see this as some sort of Anglo-civilization invasion. Right.
Exterior.
Exactly. Or even to mistake, and this happens a little bit, to mistake evangelicalism for Americanness. There's not a lot of that, but you see some of it.
There's some of it, yeah.
And in other countries, that's rampant.
Yeah.
So anyway, I do want Brazilians to answer that question, and I certainly like to participate in that. So the first Protestant colony in Brazil was French Huguenots. And here in my own church, so I'm a ministry of Christ Church in Moscow. So what we call them our older brother, Huguenot heritage. And we call them our older brother because we're named after, Missão Guanabara is named after the colony at Guanabara, founded by Huguenots, who all were killed or ended up fleeing back to France by the Portuguese. But the first confession of faith, the first Protestant confession of faith in the Americas came from that town, from that attempt to establish a colony. And I'd love to go down with the head of that ministry, Francis Fucachon, and that the Guanabara Bay is in Rio, so it was just jungle then. But so I'd love to do a documentary and just help Brazilians connect. The Reformed Brazilians connect their faith to Brazil. But all that being said, it's going to have to be new. It's going to have to be the next new thing.
Right.
I mean, the Christian faith is a faith that of moving forward. Like we stand on shoulders and we go toward the end. And so, although I decry the myth of progress, and new things are not better because they're new, yet we go from glory to glory. And so, whatever that next glory is, it should stand on shoulders, but it's okay to stand on French and English and American shoulders.
Yeah.
And then establish that Brazilian identity. I think that what Brazilians can bring to Protestantism is a little bit of actually what my denomination already is kind of known for, which is a feasting culture. Maybe the unfrozen chosen. Oh yeah.
Yeah, creating Brazilian Christianity that is first Christian and then Brazilian,
Right.
and that not having it not seen as a Western add-on to a Brazilian culture,
Right.
but as
Again, just because like a soapbox of mine, Brazil is the West, but yeah, not a Northern or Anglo-Saxon
English,
right.
right? Yeah, exactly. Not seeing it as like we have Brazilian culture and then there's this cool thing we do on the side,
Right.
but as this is what should be Brazilian culture itself.
Exactly.
Yeah. What can people on this side of that Brazilian country line do
to help with the gospel in Brazil?
Yeah.
Well, you can certainly support my ministry through Christ Church, and that would include financial support. So the Christ Church website has a little giving tab, and we're in there. But mostly, I would just because it's a whole other place and a whole other language. I would actually just be super happy if your viewers talked to me, reached out to me. If you encounter Brazilians on Twitter or whatever, talk to them. But mostly, it's Brazil does not need missionaries moving to Brazil, church planters moving to Brazil. Brazil is the second greatest missionary country in the world. Only the United States sends more missionaries.
Right.
And Brazil could even be number one if they didn't have to bring all their missionaries back every time their currency collapses, So, there's obviously work to be done. If you want to go plant a church in Brazil, do it, right? But what the church in Brazil needs is that knowledge of the next steps, right? Yeah. Okay, so now we're gonna build a church building and we're gonna make a school and our kids are going to be Christians and our kids' what does all that mean? Like, arts, etc. And that I think takes conversation more than anything. So if people want to help Brazil and this, I think Brazil and the United States have a lot of potential fraternity. Whatever you're good at doing, whatever art, whatever craft, whatever science you're good at, could be a blessing to Brazil and the Brazilian church. Yeah.
Where can people find your ministry, and also who should they follow Brazilian people on X?
Yeah. Man, I guess I only think of a few of my friends, but I'll tell you, I'll give, I guess, the on X, the two CREC pastors. I don't know how much of your audience are CREC heads, but at McHert, MCHERTT, he is Brazilian despite the last name, and then at Evandro da Rosa, you can follow me on X, Joffre Swait. And then our own website is missãoguanabara.com, but you can also find us through the Christ Church website. I know Missão Guanabara is probably not intuitive to people. I don't know how to spell.
I'll put links in the description.
Perfect. Yeah. We've got a YouTube channel, et cetera, that people could follow along with. Most of that's in Portuguese. On Substack, you can sign up for our newsletter in English. So if you search Missão Guanabara, you can find our newsletter in English.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah. See you guys.